Chapter 7. The Fiddler's Bill. But when that bill came, the fiddler's bill, that bill for the tea, it was so much heavier than anyone expected, Boston was thrown into a paroxysm of anger and despair. There had been many a moderate man who had thought the tea party a bit lawless and was now ready to vote payment for the tea. But when these men heard how cruelly the town was to be punished, they swore it would never be paid for. And those other 13 colonies, up to this time many of them had had little interest in Boston's struggles. Now they were united as never before. The punishment united the often jealous, often indifferent, separate colonies as the Tea Party itself had not. Sam Adams was so happy his hands shook worse than ever. For it had been voted in far-off London that the port of Boston should be closed. Not one ship might enter, not one ship might leave the port, except only His Majesty's warships and transports, until the tea was paid for. Boston was to be starved into submission. On that day, that 1st of June, 1774, Johnny and Rab, like almost all the other citizens, did no work, but wandered from place to place over the town. People were standing in angry knots, talking, gesticulating, swearing that yes, they would starve, they would go down to ruin rather than give in now. Even many of the Tories were talking like that, for the punishment fell equally heavy upon the king's most loyal subjects in Boston and on the very Indians who had tossed the tea overboard. This closing of the port of Boston was indeed tyranny. This was oppression. This was the last straw upon the back of many a moderate man. The boys strolled the waterfront. Here on Long Wharf, merchants' counting houses were closed and shuttered. Sail lofts deserted, the riggers and porters stood idle. Overnight, hundreds of such and sailors and ropemakers, wharfingers and dockhands had been thrown out of work. The great ships of Boston, which had been bringing wealth for over 100 years, were idle at their berths. Not one might come and go. At first it was the men of the ships and wharves that were thrown out of work and could not get food for their families. The paralysis that started there would soon spread out and include everybody. For who now could buy new clothes? The clothiers and tailors would close shop. Not one man in Boston could afford a silver basin. The silversmiths would not last long. Nobody could pay rent. The wealthy landowners were headed for bankruptcy. "So," said Rab cheerfully, "looks like we'd all starve together." They stood at the very end of Long Wharf, which ran a half-mile out into the harbor. They could see the Captain, British flagship, stationed between Long and Hancock's Wharf, and over by Governor's Island, the Lively, and beyond, the Mercury, the Magdalen, the Tartar. His Majesty's fleet surrounded Boston, enforcing the Port Act. "Uncle Lorne is upset. He says the printers will not be able to go on with the newspapers. He won't be able to collect subscriptions, or get any advertising. He won't be able to buy paper nor ink." "He's sending the Webb twins home?" "Yes, back to Chelmsford. But he and I can manage. The Observer is to be half-size. He won't give up. He'll keep on printing, and printing about our wrongs and our rights until he drops dead at his press or gets hanged." There had been a good deal of talk about hanging. Governor Hutchinson was ordered to England. General Gage from now on would be in charge. Regiment upon regiment of the finest British troops were arriving. They were planning to put down sedition all right, and everyone knew that Gage had the right to send any man whom he believed a leader in this revolt against England to London and the parody of a trial, certain death on the gallows. Or, if he wished, Gage might erect his gallows over here. Sam Adams and Hancock, Dr. Warren, perhaps still James Otis, would be the first to go. Certainly all the other members of the Observers, if ever their names were known, would follow, and so would all the Whig printers of Boston. No wonder Uncle Lorne was a little nervous. By nature, he was a timid man, yet timid or bold, he would go on printing, begging the people of Massachusetts to wake up and resist this tyranny before it was too late. He would print until he had not a sheet of paper left to print on, or until the very day the gallows was set up for him. As yet, only the British men of war had arrived, but the transports were on the seas. Soon it seemed that almost every day another transport put in. There was the rattle of drums, with the shouts of officers, and off the ships poured a flood, scarlet as a tide of blood. Boston was inundated with British soldiers, and now every third person one met in the street wore the handsome uniform of King George III. There wasn't much work to do. Rab by himself could set the entire newspaper in a day. The subscriptions had dropped, partly because many people could not afford paper, and partly because so many Whig families were leaving Boston for the country. Johnny could deliver the Boston papers in a morning, instead of taking all day. June was ending, and the boys stood about the common watching the soldiers of the 1st Brigade camped there under Earl Percy. Row upon row of identical tents, cook fires, tethered horses of officers, camp followers, stacked muskets, the quick, smart pacing of sentries. All was neat and orderly. Muskets. It was the muskets which interested Rab the most. Already on every village green throughout New England, men and boys were drilling in defiance of the king's orders. They said they were afraid of an attack from the French. These men had no uniforms. They came from the fields and farms in the very clothes they used for plowing. That was all right. But the weapons they brought to their drilling were not. Many had ancient flintlocks, old squirrel guns, handed down for generations. Rab, for instance, all that spring had been going to Lexington once or twice a week to drill with his fellow townsmen. But he could not beg nor buy a decent gun. He drilled with an old fowling piece his grandsire had given him to shoot ducks on the Concord River. Never had Johnny seen Rab so bothered about anything as he was over his inability to get himself a good modern gun. "I don't mind their shooting at me," he would say to Johnny, "and I don't mind shooting at them, but God give me a gun in my hands that can do better than knock over a rabbit at 10 feet. The British soldiers went about their business as though oblivious of the many hostile, curious eyes watching them. They were confident that these provincials, these yokels now gaping at their equipment, gauging the manner of fighting men they were, would be so impressed they would never stand up and fight them. Rab, so concerned over a gun as he was, did an uncharacteristic foolish thing. The two boys were standing close to a stack of muskets. As Rab explained to Johnny their good points, he put out a hand and touched the lock on one. Without even showing bad temper, almost impartially, a mounted officer sitting his horse close by chatting with a couple of Boston's Tory girls, swung about and struck Rab a heavy blow on the side of his head with the flat of his sword. Then he went on flirting with the girls as though nothing had happened. Rab never knew what hit him. Now a sergeant came bawling, "Spectators are not to intrude. Get back behind them ropes. Get back, all of you, get back." Johnny stayed where he was beside the unconscious Rab. Yet, after this act of sudden violence, the boys were well treated. Johnny was not run through because he stayed with his friend, did not obey the sergeant. A gray, older man, a medical officer, approached, called for water, sponged Rab's face for him, and said he was coming to. Johnny was not to worry. What was he doing? Just looking at a gun. Touching it? Well, yes. And only got hit over the head. He got off easy. Filching a soldier's arms is a serious misdemeanor. Wonder Lieutenant Bragg didn't kill him. Rab said thickly, "I hadn't thought to filch it. Not a bad idea. I guess I'll... He was still groggy from the blow. "If I ever get a chance, I'll..." The medical man only laughed at him. "Now, boys," he said seriously, "you forget talk like that. You remember that we don't like being here in Boston any better than you like having us. I'd rather be with my wife and children in Bath. We're both in a tight spot. But if we keep our tempers and you keep your tempers, why, we can fix things up between us somehow. We're all one people, you know." As he talked, Johnny had an experience he was to have many more times. The troops would do something he considered unforgivable, like nearly braining Rab for merely touching a gun, and then the next moment be so civil and friendly he could not help but like them, at least some of them, as individuals. The medical man, noticing Johnny's riding boots and spurs, was saying, "I've a cousin lives over in Cambridge. Haven't had a chance to send him a letter. Do either of you know a boy with a good horse who could ride for me?" Rab was mouthing yes at Johnny. "I've got a good horse." "Come to me at 1 o'clock sharp this noon. I'm quartered on Mr. Shaw, North Square." On the way home, Rab said, "If you can get started carrying messages for him, others may follow. Might be we could learn things Sam Adams and Dr. Warren and Paul Revere would like to know. They wouldn't dare send their own orderlies, fearful somebody might kill them. I'd thought of that myself." But at 1 o'clock, as he stood beside Goblin in North Square receiving money and the letter from the medical captain, also a pleasant smile, one thing upset him. Paul Revere's house was almost next door. There was a girl there about his age. She was standing before her house, almost bent horizontal at the hips. She was sticking out at him the longest, reddest tongue he had ever seen. And as he mounted and swung about to leave the British officer, he heard her shrilling in a horrible sing-song, "He loves the British, he loves the British." But that night, on his return, when he went to tell Mr. Revere there was no question but that Mr. Shirtliff of Cambridge, always considered a lukewarm Whig, was in reality a leader of Tories in Middlesex County, he saw little Miss Revere again. "Father says," she apologized handsomely, "that I'm not to believe everything I see, and—" "Believe anything you like." Johnny was feeling good. He had charged the medical man 3 times the price he would have dared charge a Yankee, and by what Mr. Shirtliff had said to his wife on reading this letter he had found out something worth, not much, but at least worth knowing. "I like to see you stick out your tongue," he went on. "It is so long and red I thought at first it was a hound dog dressed up in pink petticoats. I never guessed it was a young lady." 2. Now Johnny no longer kept half the money he and Goblin earned carrying letters. He charged the British officers such a figure, and they never complained. He was bringing in a considerable sum, and he gave it all to Aunt Lorne to buy food for her family, of which he was one. At first she wouldn't take it. Then she cried and kissed him on the little peak of hair that turned down upon his forehead, and did take it. No gallows was set up to hang rebels. General Gage was doing his best to make friends with the people of Boston. He did not stop the flood of treasonable oratory which poured forth from men like Warren and Quincy. He did not prohibit the publication of such inflammatory presses as the Observer. The Whigs had their say. The papers were allowed to print outrageous things about himself and his troops. He was not brilliant, but he was no tyrant. In time, he confidently expected all the trouble would smooth out by itself, if only the soldiers and the inhabitants did not get to quarreling. Nor did Boston starve. From one end of the Atlantic seaboard to the other, towns and even villages sent great shipments of food. Rice from South Carolina, or quintals of fish from Marblehead. Money even from London, for there was much sympathy in England for Boston. Flour, corn, beef, sheep, all day were passing through the town gates upon the neck, in carts and wagons. This was the only road connecting Boston with the mainland. Formerly, almost everything she used came to her on her hundreds of famous ships. Now the ships were lying like dead birds along her wharves. So July was ending. Johnny had not seen Priscilla Lapham for 3 weeks. His schedule was now so much upset, he never did know when he would be in North Square on a Thursday. And every Sunday of late he had gone out to Lexington to watch the Minutemen drilling, a little secretly, behind Grandsire Silsby's great barn. It might be Sabbath-breaking, but these men were so sure they were doing God's will and preparing to resist tyranny they did not care. Johnny could only stand and watch. True enough, there were boys no older than he drilling there, but his crippled hand made it impossible for him to pull a trigger. This incapacity fretted him badly, and he would sometimes take it out on Rab. The militia troops didn't look like much. They had funny-looking guns. They were funny-looking men, and Rab let him talk. He knew why Johnny was criticizing. It was because he could not be one himself. So he had not seen Scylla since late in June. Thus far, she had never once come to the Observer's office in Salt Lane. It was as if she recognized it as that other world into which Johnny Tremain had disappeared and knew that she could not follow him. So Johnny was surprised one afternoon, riding back from Plymouth where he had delivered a letter from Major Pitcairn, to find her sitting in the shop with Rab. She did not look at all forlorn, in her fresh lavender muslin frock, her neat white stockings and black pumps. Her head was tipped back and she was laughing. She had been drawing a picture and Rab was telling her what to draw. For once, for the first time since Johnny had left the Laphams, Izana was not with her. Johnny was so glad to see her, he wondered could it have been that it was Izana always hanging on to her, always showing off, that had irritated him, made him not care whether he kept his rendezvous with the girls or not. As he came in, booted and spurred, sunburned and hatless, Scylla glanced at him. Her eyes were happy, filled to the brim with happiness. She had been having such a good time with Rab. And unconsciously and unreasonably, Johnny stiffened. He couldn't see why she and Rab should be having such a good time. They were explaining. Rab had wanted a picture of Boston being strangled to death by a British grenadier. It was for the newspaper, and she, Scylla, having chanced in, had drawn it beautifully, and now Johnny would have to cut a block of it for printing. I can do it. Not very well, of course, but I can. You certainly can draw better and better. Mr. Tweedy can draw. He's giving me lessons. And Rab posed for the British grenadier. Look, I've pictures of him here. Those? Rab? They look more like woodchucks than Rab to me, he said. But Scylla knew he thought they were fine pictures and he was proud of her. She was so pretty Johnny could hardly think where all this prettiness came from, and sourly he thought it came from Rab. He had a way of lighting people up, showing them at their best. No, partly at least it was because of that lavender dress, and her face had color in it because she was eating enough. When the troops came and times were so hard, Scylla had always given a large share of her food to Izana and had grown to look more peaked and worried every week. Now she looked fine. Sit there, like that, Johnny. I'm going to draw you too. You're easier than Rab. Why am I easier than Rab? Because, she said, intentionally hurting his feelings. You're just a child yet. Rab's grown up. There. You don't mind if I make you look a little like a raccoon, do you? I'll draw a bushy tail for you, Scylla, Rab said. Johnny fidgeted, as people do who are having their pictures drawn, crazy to see what somebody else thinks they look like. It wasn't much of a picture. Between them, they had drawn a funny half-raccoon, half-boy. Somehow it did look like Johnny, and they all laughed. 4 o'clock. I must be getting back. I was told to pick up a pair of gloves on Queen Street and be back at 5. She got up, tied a flowered bonnet on her head, and started for the door. Wait, Scylla, you haven't told me any news. He had forgotten how recently her news had bored him. That's right, I've just told Rab. Johnny, I won't be able to meet you regularly anymore. Things have changed. How so? Your mother mad? No, that is, yes, she is mad, but about something else. She's mad because Dorcas really did have the guts to run off and marry Frizzell Jr. just as soon as Mr. Tweedy declared for her. Dorcas isn't going to get much of that elegance she was always out after from Frizzell Jr. No, but she doesn't care. The young girl's voice softened. She says when you really are in love, you don't care much about anything, except him. Johnny, remembering the gawky, callow, but upstanding young leather dresser of Fish Street, was surprised that anyone could value him so highly. She ran off with Frizzell Jr. just as soon as Mr. Tweedy came out and said he preferred her to Madge. But what put Ma right through the roof was when he said he was in no hurry. He didn't mind passing up Madge and waiting for me. You? Cried Johnny hotly. That old man! If he is a man. Why, he must be about 40. Scylla, you're lying to me if you say anybody's talking of marrying you. I was 15 last month, and you were 15 way back in January. I'd not stopped to think. Rab, did you hear that? I'm only a year younger than you are now. Rab grinned. I was 17 last week. Johnny thought that was like Rab, slipping off by himself, getting ahead of you, and then grinning at you out of the corner of his mouth. Mother didn't like it, Mr. Tweedy stalling like that. And then one thing happened after another. For instance? Ever since, well, last fall, the lights have been giving us work to do. Mr. Tweedy is clever, although so queer. A couple of weeks ago, Miss Light came in. She wanted her arms, that old rising sun, engraved on the top of her riding whip. So she stands about, and I stand about, and Mr. Tweedy and Ma. The shop door was open into the backyard, and Izana was standing about, too, in the backyard. I'll bet she was. Yes, Miss Lavinia just about had a fit. What was Izana doing? Throwing up. I had just washed her hair, said Scylla dreamily, and the sun was on it. Oh, I see, said Johnny sourly. And Izana was walking back and forth reciting some poetry to herself, acting it out. Something about Captain Kidd and how he sailed. Old Stumpy Joe, the one-legged sailor man, taught it to her. Miss Lavinia stood there watching Izana, and she looked more like something cut out of stone than a human being. She can't help it, said Johnny, who liked to run her down. She was born that way. Go on. She just turned her head like that and said to Ma through her teeth like this, Ma'am, I'm taking that child with me. Ma first said she wouldn't, and then said she couldn't stand between Izana and such an opportunity. And Izana said she wouldn't go without me. So it was fixed this way. I'm signed up to work in the kitchen or help Miss Lavinia dress or anything for a year, and Izana is thrown in for nothing, because she's so young and has a delicate stomach. We're both living with the lights. Do you like her? Sometimes. Well, yes. Well, I think she's disagreeable. He hoped Scylla would contradict him, but she did not. So now I'll be going back. She only gave me the afternoon off. I thought I'd tell you not to look for me around North Square anymore. Johnny felt guilty. I do leave a paper at the lights every Thursday. Scylla said nothing, but looked at him out of the corners of her eyes. Couldn't I see you sometime? Maybe? I don't know. You might ask Mrs. Bessie, the cook. She's sort of a friend of mine. So, goodbye. I'll be going on. Scylla had changed so much Johnny felt confused. One thing was certain. She wasn't going to hang around and wait for him either on street corners or at back doors, and then not have him show up. Goodbye, Scylla. I'll see you soon. But Rab did not say goodbye. He did not even ask her if he might walk home with her to Beacon Hill. He simply went, and Johnny was mad. If anyone walked home with Scylla, it should be himself, or Rab might have said, Come on, Johnny, we'll both walk over to the lights with Scylla. But he'd forgive Rab for intruding himself. He'd cook him up a mess of eggs for supper. It would take about 15 minutes to go to the lights, 15 minutes to get back. He built the fire and cooked the eggs. He cooked them and cooked them. At last, in disgust, he took them off and ate them, every now and then going down to consult the shop clock. Rab was gone for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes. Nor did he miss the eggs Johnny had eaten. He had been very well fed by Mrs. Bessie in the light kitchen, and he thought Scylla was a grand kid. He had had a good time. You could see it in his eyes, and whenever he looked at Johnny's long face, he looked ready to laugh. 3. Now the only regularity in Johnny's life was the great effort he made to see Scylla every Thursday and the care he gave to Goblin. But when he went to the Afric Queen, he was going into enemy territory. The tavern had been taken over bodily by British officers. Chief among them was Colonel Francis Smith. Goblin was the only horse in the stable that did not belong to a British officer, for the landlord had sent his to the country, fearing they would either be commandeered by the occupying troops or that he could not get hay for them. About the stables, British orderlies, officers, servants, and small British horseboys, the servants of the servants, were always congregating. Johnny paid little heed to them. They all knew that he rode for the Observer, but they also knew that he often rode for their own officers. Sometimes they picked on him. And once, when things got too bad and he felt he had to fight it out with the worst bully, the other boys, all his enemies, stood about demanding fair play, saying, "Well fought, Yankee, and that's neat," when he beat the bully. He had rather thought the whole gang would be on him the second he got the bully down. Instead, they merely respected him. So he made out better than he could have expected until one day he found that Colonel Smith had a new horseboy. The one he had brought over with him had run away, so he had told his orderly officer to find a new one, and that boy was Dove. Johnny saw him grinning sheepishly at him, hoping they might be friends. They, the only two local boys at the stable. "You," Johnny muttered out of the corner of his mouth, "you trash, you milk pudding, you cottage cheese slug. So, you're not above going to work for them, are you?" "Honest, Johnny, I gotta eat. Old Tweety fired me." An orderly stuck his head in the stable. "Boy," he said to Johnny, "Colonel Smith has a letter to go to Milton. Please go to the parlor and see him or Lieutenant Stranger about it." A slow, gat-toothed grin spread over Dove's face. "Looks like you work for them, too." "Looks like," said Johnny fiercely. He saw the colonel, went home for his boots and spurs, then took out Goblin and saddled him. One of the English boys had got Dove down and was twisting his arm, making him swear allegiance to His Britannic Majesty, Gracious George III. Dove was swearing fast enough and protesting that that was the way he really felt. All rebels should be hung. Johnny had a queer feeling at the pit of his stomach. He wanted to go to his rescue. He had to make himself remember that he hated Dove. "But that fellow over there," Dove was pointing to Johnny, "is really on the other side and—" Johnny left Dove to his fate. It was a crisp, fresh day for summer, the first respite after a week of unendurable heat. Goblin felt fine. He came sidling out of the stable, dancing and playing. Johnny let him move about, get the kinks out of him. He loved the horse. He loved the admiration he saw on every face. Grooms dropping currycombs, officers looking out of windows and talking to each other and nodding toward Goblin, chambermaids, rich Tory gentlemen, all stopped to stare when Goblin played. Although he mostly kept his eyes on Goblin's wickedly flattened ears, it is the only way you can tell which way a horse will jump next, he did notice a thick, red face at the parlor window, Colonel Smith, and he heard his booming voice. "Boy, one moment." Doubtless he had changed his mind about that letter from Milton. Lieutenant Stranger, his orderly officer, was coming out of the parlor. He had on no hat, his spurs were in his hand. He was a dark, young fellow, not much older than Rab, and something in both his color and carriage had always made Johnny think of Rab. "That's quite a horse you have there." "He's all right." "Well, we sort of hate to see a damned Yankee on top of a good horse like that. How much will you take?" "He belongs to my master, Mr. Lorne." "Colonel Smith," he called to the stiff red face at the window, "this horse belongs to Lorne, the printer. Boston Observer, you know. We can commandeer him all right. You fix a proper price." "So, boy, how much will your master take for him?" "He's not for sale." "Oh, he isn't, is he? You know damned little about the rights of His Majesty's armed forces. You get off, and I'll try him around the block and see how I think he would suit Colonel Smith." He knelt and buckled on his spurs. The handsome black washerwoman of the inn, Lydia, came out carrying a hamper of wet clothes. Johnny had an idea. "All right, Lieutenant Stranger," he said politely. "Put the stirrups down a couple of notches. Now, hand me my gloves. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Goblin was watching out of the corner of his crystalline blue eyes. Not for months had anyone but Johnny Tremain been on his back. But the lieutenant mounted confidently, picked up the reins, and held them exactly as Goblin liked. The horse moved quietly out of the inn yard. Colonel Smith's face disappeared from the parlor window. "Lydia," said Johnny as he strolled over to the washerwoman, "I'll help you with those clothes." She gave him a dazzling smile. "My land, Johnny boy, I could do with a bit of help. Them Britishers expect a clean sheet every week and seems like a clean shirt every day." Johnny gravely pinned a couple of shirts on the line, his mouth, like Lydia's, full of wooden clothespins. The ruffled shirts began snapping smartly in the breeze. "Sheets?" "We've got 17 officers staying with us. We got sheets by the dozen." "Look, Lydia, you lend me a sheet for just a few moments. If I get it dirty, I'll wash it, and besides, I'll hang up every sheet in your basket." "Boy, I don't know what you're up to, and I suspect no good." "You'll do as I say?" "If it's that Lieutenant Stranger what's took your horse away from you, I'll do plenty. He wants to commandeer Goblin for his colonel." "Whee! Don't know commandeer, but it sounds dreadful cruel to me." "It is a way you cook things," said Johnny soberly. "My land, boy, don't you let them cook that pretty horse of yours." "I'll cook them first. Now, look, we've got to stand fairly near to the driveway like this. You get on that end of the sheet, and I on this, and we'll let her fill up with wind. Wait, he's coming back. So, now let go, Lydia. Quick! Let go!" The sheet bellied out like a sail when Lydia let go. Goblin, quickly recognizing Stranger's skill and goodwill, had behaved admirably. The lieutenant thought he'd advise his colonel to pay a pretty fancy price for such a choice beast. Colonel Smith, a timid horseman, liked showy mounts. This one was showy, all right, with his strange pale coat and mane and tail like mahogany. He was young and high-strung. Stranger believed he himself would have to ride him for the next month to get him gentle enough for his superior. But his gaits were like dancing. "Let me see," he was thinking. "I'll offer long—" And then the whole earth blew up from under him and hit him a terrific blow on his seat. There was a splash as well. He had landed in a mud puddle. The horse was disappearing into the stable. He got up, ruefully looked at his white breeches, shrugged, and walked over to where Johnny was diligently pinning up sheets. Both he and Lydia had their backs discreetly turned. "Well," he said to Johnny belligerently. "Yes, sir." "I'd already noticed your horse worries a bit over blown paper in the streets, things like that. I suppose you know that, too." "Yes, sir." "Take those damned clothespins out of your mouth and turn around and answer me." Once the clothespins were out of his mouth, it was hard not to laugh. "Answer you what, sir?" "You flapped that sheet on purpose, just for the fun of seeing me sit in a puddle, and to keep my horse out of the army." "Oh, you—" said Stranger, pretending to be angry, but Johnny knew that at heart he was not. Colonel Smith's great red face once more appeared. "How'd he ride, Lieutenant? Gad, sir, what? Where's the horse, sir? What have you been mucking about in?" "Mud puddles, sir. I fell off." He made no effort to excuse himself. "Beast vicious, eh?" "No, sir, just a mite jumpy. No good for army work, nor even just hacking about Boston." "But that damn boy, how does he manage?" "It's his horse, sir." "Thanks, Lieutenant, you can look elsewhere for me." The head went in. Stranger was stretching himself lightly. "I'll drink my beer standing up for a few days," he said to no one in particular. Then, as an afterthought, "Beer. Hi, kitchen," he yelled, in the arrogant way Johnny noticed the young officers always called for service. "2 tankards of beer, out here in the yard." He turned to Johnny. "What's your horse's name?" "Goblin." "We'll drink to Goblin. Potboy, give that tankard to this young man. You know, of course, there's no real cure for a horse that shies as badly as that." "I've been told he'll never be gentle." If he was as good as he looks, I'd hate to guess what he'd be worth. As it is, I'd not give 15 shillings for him, except," and he smiled suddenly, "for myself to ride. Have you schooled him in jumping?" "No, we're not fancy riders over here. At the foot of the common you'll find a series of hurdles we've put up. If happens you're over there sometime when I am, I'll show you a bit." "Thank you, sir." "Does he still throw you sometimes?" "Sometimes. I'd have gone off fast enough when that sheet let loose." "That sheet? Yes, that was a trick. That was good. That was fine. Hi, you black wench. You finish this beer for me and take the tankards back to the kitchen." And off he stalked, still chuckling to himself. Beginning with that day when Goblin had tumbled Lieutenant Stranger in the mud, Johnny had no more trouble with the British stable boys. When it became hard for him to get the oats and hay for Goblin, they told him he might use theirs. But Dove, who was always swearing allegiance to England, and Johnny knew that he was honestly a Tory, was the butt of all their jokes. Dove clung to Johnny like a drowning man, and Johnny did protect him. He could not help himself. So Dove began oozing into his life. He spent most of his free time at the Observer's office and was always complaining, always gorging himself on the scarce food, and bored both Johnny and Rab. But Rab said, and Johnny knew this was true, sometime the British would not stay tamely shut up in Boston. Sometime they'd strike out and seize the military supplies they knew the provincials were collecting. A colonel's horseboy might very well know a day or so, or even a few hours before a colonel marched. It was up to Johnny to keep in touch with Dove. It was all right for Rab to talk. Rab was training with the armed forces. But what could Johnny do? Not much, it seemed to him, except be bored to death for his country.
This book is continued on Disc 5.